All right, let's get into session hijacking. Session hijacking is a really fun module only because you let somebody else do all the hard work and then you get to reap the rewards from it. So let's take it apart section by section. So why does this happen? Okay, some of the reasons are obvious, some of them are not so obvious. So let's look at them. No account lockouts. If you have an infinite session time between the client and the server and you aren't locking out or forcing a log off of some sort, well then that becomes a bowl of goodness for the penetration tester. Insecure session handling. When does the session get created? Sometimes it gets created before you authenticate, sometimes after authentication. It's really, really good for the penetration tester when it happens before you authenticate, because if you can gather that session ID prior to supplying your authentication, well then you could perhaps predict the next round of session information. Or maybe a small session ID. If there's only an 8-bit field, then there's 2 to the power of 8, 256 possible combinations. If there's a 16-bit field, well then there's 65,000 combinations. Or if there's a 24-bit field, well then there's 16 million possible combinations. So the longer or the key spaces of the session ID, the more possible values that you have to exhaust in order to actually take over a session. So from the pen tester's point of view, the shorter the session space, the easier it is for the penetration tester. Also, weak generation algorithms. If you generate your session ID on like a date timestamp, well then that would be relatively easy because you just start guessing dates and times and then you use that to construct your session ID. Infinite session time. If there's no logout or lockout capability and you can just stay connected to, for example, X website, won't name names here, but if you could just stay connected and come back 5-6 hours, 2-3 days later and you're still connected, well then that exponentially increases the likelihood of someone being able to take over somebody's session. Anything in clear text is of value to the penetration tester because if it's in clear text, you can read it. If you can read it and sniff it, well then ultimately you can start predicting the sessions. We're always interested in predictable information, whatever format that comes in. In most of the context here, we're talking about session IDs in general, but if anything is predictable, that is always of value to the penetration tester. Also, the sequence numbers in themselves. How do you create the sequence number? How did the developer write them? At first, they may seem like you can't make any sense out of them, but a little bit of reverse engineering and you could get really, really valuable information really, really quickly. So some of the basic concepts here I want to talk about and really just lay the foundation for why session hijacking is even possible. All right. So the first piece of this is the TCP three-way handshake. Remember, I'm going to send a synchronization request to the server. The server is going to reply with an acknowledgement and their own synchronization request. And then, of course, all I have to do is acknowledge it. That is your three-way handshake. Okay? So that ultimately can be manipulated in the context of session hijacking. Also, spoofing versus hijacking. Well, spoofing is simply claiming somebody else's identity, but it's normally directly from the client to the server. Where session hijacking is really watching somebody else's, client to server, and then ultimately inserting yourself either actively or passively to take over that. So while identity spoofing is kind of a precursor, or it's one style of attack, session hijacking is really different altogether because you are realistically anticipating on, or at least you have the option to take over somebody else's session and get access to their resources. Which brings us to active versus passive. Passive session hijacking is realistically just listening or sniffing or eavesdropping to the details of the conversation, where active means that we take our client, our source or our client, we knock them offline and then actively access their resources on the behalf of the original client. The server, or in this case, is indifferent of who's actually accessing the resources. So you're kind of swapping out the original source. Next, we can go into application versus network. This is really the focal point where you can focus your time. You could do network level session hijacking, or you can do application session hijacking. It just really depends on where do you want to exploit the software. Next is session IDs in themselves. So how are they created? How are they used? How are they handled? How are they set up, used, terminated? The penetration tester is going to spend a significant amount of time learning all of how this is done manually, and then of course write algorithms so that the computers or scripts can actually do this automatically. So while manually is very, very painful, and it's worth knowing how to do because it, one, lays the foundation for how this attack works, ideally what you want is to use a program where you just click a button and say take over session. All right. Let's do man in the browser. Okay, any sort of software where you have to set up an internal proxy. A great example of this is the Burp Suite, because basically you're your own proxy, and then that application sniffs all the traffic and then forwards it on. So effectively there's a proxy of some sort in the relationship between the original client and the server, whether that happens directly through the web browser or in between over the network by a third party, i.e. the penetration tester. So we just talked about man in the browser, but then you also have man in the middle. So it's kind of the same concept, except one is literally a redirect within a web browser or an application, where the man in the middle technique is realistically across the network somewhere. Also easily accomplished through a cross-site script. Right? This is running a script from one site to another. So whether you're using the cross-site script to steal a cookie or some other valuable information like a session ID, cross-site scripting is a very, very popular attack, especially nowadays. All right? This is the basic architecture. It's client and server, or the victim and some sort of application service. And the attacker wants to monitor this conversation, then ultimately knock the victim offline and then take over and get access to that server-side service or resource. Passively, the attacker would just listen. Actively, the attacker knocks the victim offline and then connects to the server. So that's the architecture. So let's look at how this actually happens, okay? If the attacker wanted to do a session hijacking attack, then ultimately they're going to need to sniff traffic or monitor the traffic. This is where we can gain insight to the TCP three-way handshake, or how the application handles the session, or any sort of session ID information. Okay. Ultimately, if you're going to do this actively, you're going to need to desynchronize the original victim or knock them offline. And then once they're offline, then you can just take over the session. Now the server or service side of the relationship, at this point, they're not distinguishing between an authorized user and an unauthorized user, because the original victim has already done all of the hard work. They've already offended, they have already been authorized, and now you're just taking advantage of that. So the last step of this is, realistically, you can do whatever you want in the relationship, okay? So this is the how do we actually do this, okay? Now, when it comes to session IDs, there's kind of session IDs are generic terms, okay? But where do we use these session ID concepts, if you will? One common place that's easily identifiable in clear text is right through the URL. Okay, this is literally sniffing traffic, going into the application data, digging down and looking at the token. Okay, another place in which it's been found, if it's not going to be directly in the URL, some developers put it in a hidden form field. So you can use any sort of form dissecting tool or a form scalpel and dig out the hidden form field information. And this is where tools like the Chrome browser make it really, really easy to tear apart and look at a web page and the source code of that, and even to insert your own code and submit that to the server. Also, another place in which it's very commonly used is through cookies in themselves. Well, cookies are just little pieces of code that the server will put on the client to remember things about the session. So the attacker in this case could write a script that says, hey, go get me this cookie from the victim and give it back to me. And that's where things like the session ID or timestamps or lots of valuable information can be disclosed to the attacker. So that's why cross-site scripting is very much in relationship to session hijacking, because you're looking for very similar style information. All right, let's jump up here to techniques. All right, so ultimately we need to figure out how the applications are going to calculate your session IDs. Now there is the classic example of like a date and timestamp format, but even that can be hashed. But if you know the format in which the application is using it, it really doesn't matter if it's hashed or not, because you can use hashing calculators to ultimately figure out what the different sessions are. So they may not be as encrypted as at first glance. Ideally, we want to steal session information. That's what allows us to, monitor the traffic and steal the session. Okay. There was a great Firefox plugin called Firesheet years ago, and there thus far has not been a great replacement for it. We're still looking for like the replacement for it, but it was a really great Firefox add-in, and it worked great on wireless networks. So you just had to connect to the same access point, and anybody who is connected to any of the popular social networking sites, you could just monitor their sessions and literally click and take over session. It was really point and click, graphical takeover based. It was a phenomenal tool. Brute forcing is another technique here. This is where you have some sort of URL and then the session ID, has some sort of weak generation. So I use the easy example here of 001 or 002 or 003 or this date, and then add seconds to it or add milliseconds to it or add days to it, right? If it's easily predictable, well, then we can use that to our advantage as a penetration tester. Ultimately, we can use forged ICMP or ARP requests as well. Okay, so this is where we've got what we call packet crafting software, like Colasofts, or there's a variety of them out there, but specially crafted packets to start manipulating pieces of this. I want to zoom out and look at the big picture here. Ultimately, what we're doing here is we penetration testers, we are expert analysis in terms of looking at information. So you have to learn how to sniff traffic, dissect that stuff, and really become an expert. So as much as I consider myself a penetration tester, I very much consider myself just a protocol analyst, because it's one thing to watch protocols behave normally, but once you know what normal behavior is, well, then you can start manipulating them and tweaking them in small different ways, and you can start changing little tiny features of ICMP or ARP or routing protocols or applications, ultimately to trick computers into giving you some sort of detailed or juicy information. Okay, so forging ICMP or forging ARP requests is really just two of the protocols here, but you got to think of this as full-blown packet analysis. Penetration testers at the foundation must be experts in packet analysis at the end of the day, and I would even go as far as to say log file analysis as well. All right, so let's look at the network level. Couple concepts here. You have blind hijacking. Anything blind is a technique where you don't see the results, right? So you don't know if it works. It's kind of like throwing a grenade on the other side of a wall and you don't know if it blew up or not, okay? Well, we get the same thing from the network level, whether it be SQL injection or session hijacking. Code goes in, but you don't get any response or any information back to you, the end user, or the penetration tester. UDP hijacking is also possible. While TCP has additional fields compared to that of UDP, it has things like sequence numbers and acknowledgements and sliding windows and flow control, and has lots of information. UDP has none of that. And one way that you can easily learn how the difference between TCP and UDP is sniff some traffic. See the sniffing module. Go back to that one and rewatch it again. okay? Because when you look at sniffing TCP versus UDP, the best way to learn about these protocols is to sniff the traffic and watch the normal behavior of them. Once you understand the normal behavior, then you can start using packet crafters and then manipulating that to achieve some sort of objective, whether it be like man in the middle or cross-site scripting, whatever. All right. TCP/IP. Now we are still on version 4, so it's not going away yet. All right. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. You know, version 6 has been out for some time now, and we're just slowly starting to go in the IPv6 route in 2014, but it's not here yet, okay? So there's still going to be plenty of hacking to do on TCP/IP version 4 networks for some time to come. So if you haven't learned TCP/IP version 4, it's never too late to learn, because I still believe, just like there's old Windows servers and NT4 servers that are still around for whatever reason, there's still going to be TCP/IP version 4 networks for years and years and years and years to come. Reset hijacking. Now, to appreciate reset hijacking, you have to go look at the TCP protocol. Remember, I send you a synchronization, you reply with your acknowledgement and your synchronization, and then I finally acknowledge that. Well, in a normal conversation, if we're done, I would send a finished request, or whatever side's done sends the finished request. It's kind of an analogous to when you're done talking on the phone. If you're finished, you say, hey, I'm done, I'm going to hang up. Well, a reset is kind of like all of a sudden the phone was disconnected and you have to pick up and redial again, okay? So reset hijacking is realistically sending a reset packet to one side of the conversation, either the victim or the server, the client or the server, and tricking them into some sort of behavior. So if I could send you a reset packet and you think, oh, I've been disconnected, let me pick up the phone and dial again, and this time you're dialing to, you know, the attacker as opposed to legitimate service, well, you could take over a session. It's an easy way to kind of get yourself as to be in the middle, all right? Or IP spoofing, and we've kind of already covered that with, you know, spoofing your source address, but it's just, technically it's another component of network level of attacks, okay? So we talked about the why, we've talked about concepts, we talked about where it happened, we've talked about the network level. Now let's go look at some of the countermeasures. By far, one of the easiest ways that you can prevent session hijacking is to encrypt the traffic, or what I generically say is encrypt your stuff, right? Whatever that stuff is. Use protocols like SSH or HTTPS or whatever it is. At the network layer, you could use IPsec, or you can use them, you know, an application and use things like SSL, SSH, TLS, etc., etc. Also, use good random number generators. Some random number generators aren't really that random, which kind of defeats the purpose, and I find irony in that, because it's supposed to be random, but it's not really random. It's called pseudo-random as opposed to completely random. So use a really, really good random number generator so that when you choose your session space or that session ID, it really comes out of thin air. It's not based on anything previous. All right, so that's good. Generate the session ID after logon. You don't want to give pieces to the attacker or the penetration tester and then make them authenticate. That discloses information. So encryption and disclosure work together. Well, same thing here. If you generate the session ID after you log in or log on, well, then that naturally prevents certain information from being disclosed. Simply stated, have a log out functionality, and not only use two-factor authentication, but have a two-factor challenge, okay? It's a little bit more robust here, but it's a great way to countermeasure session hijacking. The reason being is because let's pretend the attacker takes over a session, all right? If the attacker captures the authentication information and then the server says, hey, who are you? Well, you just replay the authentication information and boom, you're in. But now if you have to tie in two factors to that, something you know, something you have, or something that you are, in addition to just regular authentication, well, then the attacker or the penetration tester is ultimately stuck, because now they don't have what the original victim has. So use two-factor challenges or two-factor authentication. That's a great countermeasure. Education. Make people aware what strange behavior is. What does session hijacking look like? If they understand the symptoms of this, well then if they identify it, they might start logging out voluntarily on their own. I mean, think of it this way. Would you start voluntarily logging out of your banking website if you know that, hey, somebody else could, take over and wipe out your account? I know I would. Also, the concepts of switches versus hubs, meaning virtual private connections versus shared mediums. All right, on things like access points, you typically can, wireless access points, you can typically sniff a lot of the association type traffic. Well, that's kind of the equivalent to a hub. Well, if you can switch that over, pun intended, switch it over to a switched environment, well, then you have these virtual private connections. Well, if port A or let's say port 1 and port 3 communicate to each other, none of the other ports on the switch or on the medium should be able to hear what that conversation is. So it's kind of like a virtual private connection just between me and you. Use strong authentication. You can use tools like ARPWatch, and there's other alternatives to ARPWatch out there, but remember, this is likely to happen on a switch or on a network somewhere, so ARPWatch detects the flooding or the knocking offline at layer 2. Also, defense in depth. In theory, don't rely on any one technique. A variety of countermeasures is probably the right way to go here. Also, use timeout features or log out or log off features. Keep your software up to date. That always goes with best practices. Make sure that you're on the latest and greatest. That way you naturally reduce your surface area of attack. And then we'll follow up with encryption at the network layer. Because session hijacking is either happening at the network level or at the application level, the more information you can naturally encrypt, well, then it's not disclosed. So we want to protect things at the network layer using things like IPsec. Therefore, the attacker or the penetration tester can't hear what's going on, then they can't predict the session tokens, then they can't take over the session. It doesn't matter if it's at the network layer or the application layer. If you're using things like SSL and TLS, well, that would be great because now the penetration tester has the same exact problem. If they can't sniff the traffic, they can't predict the sessions, they can't insert themselves into the middle, they can't knock people offline, etc., etc., etc. So session hijacking in itself is one of my favorite modules because realistically, as a penetration tester, you are letting somebody else do all of the hard work and you're taking advantage of all of the weaknesses. Let all the hard work be done by somebody else, and then you just reap the rewards of it. And there are some pretty good tools out here that can do it. Now, some of the tools are like freeware oriented, but commercial session hijacking tools are very, very expensive, and script kiddies aren't likely to afford $10,000 and $15,000 for one piece of software. All right, so session hijacking, very, very important stuff. Can be done at the click of a button. Also can be done at the script kiddie level, but nonetheless very, very important. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples.